It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Melissa Kelley to you this morning. Melissa is a star at the STM, and she has quite a following among the students in her courses in pastoral care and counseling. As some of you already know, Melissa has a master's degree from here at Boston College, and she has her doctorate from Boston University in pastoral psychology. She spent 14 years as a campus minister both at Emmanuel College here in Boston and at Boston College itself, prior to joining the faculty of the Weston School of Theology, then in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Melissa now serves as Associate Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling and as Faculty Director of the Professional Ministry Practicum at our own STM. She has written widely and has taught extensively on the topics of grief, loss, and coping. Her courses at the STM include grief and loss, death and dying, pastoral care of the family, and grief and the Bible, which I think is a team-taught course. Is that a team-taught course? Yeah. She is the author of the book Grief, Contemporary Theory, and the Practice of Ministry, which was published in 2010. Melissa, on top of all those things, is a fellow and a nationally certified pastoral counselor through the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. She's also certified in thanatology, death, dying, and bereavement through the Association for Death Education and Counseling, the primary organization here in the United States for bereavement researchers, educators, and clinicians. She is also a pastoral formation guide with the Metropolitan Association of the United Church of Christ. And I am told that on Mondays and Wednesdays she actually sleeps. Is that true? Is that correct? Oh, good. She is a person with a great deal of practical pastoral experience as well as scholarship, and she cares deeply about how individuals and communities handle loss. Please join me in welcoming Professor Melissa Kelley to speak about loss, change, and resilience in communities of faith.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Melinda. And thank you to all of you for coming today. I'm very pleased to be with you. It's wonderful to see old friends. Some of us go way, way back, and I have great respect for the work that you have been doing all these years. Some of us are meeting for the first time, and I look forward to that as well. Our topic is an interesting one: loss, change, and resilience in communities of faith. And the way I would like to proceed is in this way, that we will work in 4 sections. We will talk about loss and change itself. How do we want to think about those categories? But then we will link it with this very interesting topic of resilience. How do we respond to loss and change with resilience? The 3rd section, how does one build resilience? How does one become resilient or more resilient? And our 4th section, how do we want to think theologically about resilience? There's a lot of interesting work on resilience done in the social sciences and in medicine, but of course that wouldn't be enough for us. We want to be thinking theologically, ministerially about the topic. Throughout our time together, we are going to try to maintain a focus both on individuals and also on communities of faith. You know, we are aware that any community has a life of its own, is a discrete system in a sense. So we can talk about communities being more or less resilient, but we know that communities are also comprised of individuals. And the resilience of the individuals will certainly have some shaping effect on the community. And also the resilience of the leader, the pastoral leader, the ministerial leader, will have some shaping effect. So we want to be thinking both individually and communally on this topic. And a couple of other introductory comments. I want to say just a word about language and context in the presentation. I'll be sharing some research that has been done on these topics, and the language is not always directly applicable to this audience. Some of the studies use the language of clergy, where I would want to invite us to think about the language of pastoral caregiver, minister, ministerial leader, etc. Some of the research is done in broad religious contexts, including Catholic settings. Some is not done in a Catholic setting. Many of you, perhaps most of you, are working in Catholic settings. And so, again, we're going to want to ponder what might this research look like in a Catholic setting. All of the references that you'll see through the PowerPoint are listed at the back of your handout. There's a reference, oh, no, I'm sorry, it's a separate handout, the reference list. And finally, at the end of each section, there's going to be an invitation for you to do some personal writing first, if you choose, and then a little bit of sharing with one or two people at your table. But I want to say that this is your day. So if you want to spend those little windows, there'll be 7 to 10 minutes each. If you want to spend those in some other way, if you want to go out and breathe deeply of this beautiful air while you can, feel free. And with that, we are going to begin. So our first section, let's think about loss and change. I do find that a very helpful place to start when we talk about loss is this classic book by Mitchell and Anderson. I'm seeing some nods in the room. How many of us have read this book, or it's on our shelf? Yeah, lots of us. It came out, I think, in '84. So it truly is a classic now. I continue to draw on it because I think there are some real pearls of wisdom in the book. And one of those pearls is this typology of loss that Mitchell and Anderson offer us. They are pastoral writers, and they, through their extensive work with people who have experienced all kinds of losses, they created this typology that we could think about loss as occurring in 6 different areas. Now, right off the bat, we want to say it's not an exhaustive list. We could come up with additional categories, I'm sure. And there's often overlap. So the same experience may feel like it could fit in multiple categories. But let's just walk through how they want us to invite us to think about these categories. The first area of loss is material loss. And they suggest that this is an area that sometimes people feel a little embarrassed about, or maybe a little ashamed of, because it's describing the loss of an actual material possession of some sort. And people can feel like, well, why am I upset about that? That's rather shallow of me, isn't it? To be upset that I've lost an important possession or an item. But it's all about the meaning of that possession or that item. If you lose something that was given to you by a beloved person who has died, that's going to have quite a lot of meaning for you. The family home. What happens when the family home is sold? That can be a very difficult experience for people. Not only because that gathering place is gone, the memories perhaps have to kind of get worked with, but also it can mean that perhaps someone has died and that's why it's being sold. Or perhaps someone is no longer able to maintain the home. So it can be connected with these other sorts of losses that can be challenging. The second kind of loss they describe is relationship loss. The loss of a way of relating to another person or to a group. So an obvious example of that would be death. When someone dies, we may still feel like we're in some sort of connection with that person, but the earthly relationship is over. Divorce, a ruptured friendship, or people just sort of kind of drifting away. You know how that can happen? You mean to stay in touch, you want to stay in touch, and you don't stay in touch. And suddenly you can be without that relationship. The third category, role loss, R-O-L-E, by which they mean the loss of a particular role or way of functioning in one's life. So retirement, as welcome as that can be, and I dream about it sometimes, it can still be quite challenging, right? We're so used, at least in this culture, we're so used to kind of relying on what we do as part of how we present ourselves to the world, you know? What happens when we're not doing that thing anymore? Parenting, when that starts to shift, children get older or they leave home. I certainly have talked with lots of parents who've said, when the kids leave home, there's no loss involved. It's all good. It's all cause for celebration. But for others, it can feel more complicated than that. Systemic loss. By this category, Mitchell and Anderson are describing the loss that an entire system or group or community might go through. It's not just an individual experience. So for instance, what happens in an office or a church work setting when one of the favorite colleagues moves or retires? What happens to a neighborhood when a certain family leaves? You know, maybe it's the family that always planned the get-togethers or the block party, and those parties don't happen anymore. What happens to a neighborhood when an important building comes down or a tragedy strikes? Systems, communities, groups experience loss as well. Functional loss. By this category, they are describing the actual loss to some part of the physical body, our physical being. So it might be through an accident, through illness, through stroke, etc., and suddenly one can't function in the way one was used to. It can also come through aging, and I sometimes hear from people that that is the hardest sort of functional loss that they have experienced. And I get that, because I feel like I'm there too. Once one part of aging starts to happen, we're on the road, and we know where it's headed. And so functional loss can be quite challenging. And it can be challenging to watch it in those we care about as well. And finally, they talk about intrapsychic loss, by which they mean a loss within our own psyche, a loss in terms of how we think about things, how we experience the world, how we think about ourselves. Okay? We've all had the experience, I'm sure, at this point, of realizing that something we might once have dreamt about doing is not going to happen because we've made other choices. Or it's too late, that window has closed. Now, we might be very happy about the other choices we've made, but that can still be an occasion of intrapsychic loss, needing to accept that that dream is gone. Coming to see ourselves in certain ways that we might not love seeing about ourselves, that can be an occasion of intrapsychic loss as well. Or the same thing with other people. I remember vividly when I was probably 9 or 10, the deep experience of what I could now call intrapsychic loss. I didn't know it at the time. But the loss I felt when I finally understood that my father was never going to be president of the United States. I remember it because what I had come to understand is that the president is the most incredible man, up till then it had always been a man. The most incredible man in the country gets to be president. Well, that was my father. And so, I just knew it was only a matter of time. But when it occurred, when it finally occurred to me that I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think people are going to know my beloved father in that kind of way. I remember the experience of loss. Here's another example from the important American poet Langston Hughes, his poem called Harlem. He's talking about what happens to dreams that don't come true. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? You know, what happens if we find ourselves constantly dealing with intrapsychic loss for a variety of reasons? So I would also say that in my work with people in grief, and I'm imagining it might be true for some of you as well, intrapsychic loss is often the most common experience people are struggling with and the least recognized. First of all, because we're not usually used to thinking in these categories, but also, how often are we asked or invited to sort of reflect on those parts of ourselves or how we think about life or the world or God that maybe have felt disappointed or lost? You know, we don't get asked about that often. But that sort of, especially maybe if it's chronic intrapsychic loss, that can be quite costly. So we want to be thinking about these types of loss today, and notice how much broader that is than death. We're used to thinking about loss as death. For some people, for varieties of reasons, death is not the most difficult loss. It could be some of these other experiences. Okay, our communities of faith, of course, go through loss and change as well. And so all of those categories that we just looked at apply to individuals, but they could potentially apply to communities as well. Maybe the functional loss would be a little more challenging to make fit, perhaps, but those others, certainly. So we want to think a little more intentionally now about what do communities of faith face in terms of loss and change. Of course, if members of the community or staff people leave, are lost in some way, die, that can take quite a toll on a community. I remember doing a little bit of work many years ago with a parish whose pastor was quite ill, and the community was just really, really struggling with how do we communicate our incredible love for this man? How do we help him perhaps move into a new phase of life? How do we as a community cope with this unwelcome change? We also know, of course, there are so many demographic changes and shifts in religious life, in faith communities. And I want to share just a few examples of that from the Catholic tradition. This little bit of research is drawn from CARA, C-A-R-A, which is the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate at Georgetown University. And they released a study in just this past June on Catholicism in global perspective. So in terms of the Catholic population worldwide, it has grown by 57% since 1980. But of course, there's a lot of difference by region. So for instance, Europe's Catholic population is growing by just 6%, while the number of Catholics in Africa has grown by 238%. So the fastest growth in the Catholic tradition in the world is happening in Africa and Asia. Parish life, if we think about it worldwide, and this is CARA again, since 1980, the church has had a net gain of more than 15,200 parishes. Again, where is that happening? That varies by region. So in the Americas, the number of parishes has increased by 25%, but in Europe, the number of parishes has declined by 12%. Priests, globally, the church had only 713 more priests, diocesan and religious combined, in 2012 than it did in 1980. But where the population is growing, so are the number of priests. So the number of priests has more than doubled in Africa and Asia between 1980 and 2012. So globally, there's a lot happening. What about right in the US? We know there's a lot happening there as well. So just a little sample of that sort of change. Again, in terms of the Catholic tradition, this is based on Pew Research, the Pew Research Center. From 2007 to 2014, racial and ethnic diversity within Catholicism has grown from 35% to 41%. And at the STM, we are so lucky to have as a colleague Hofsman Ospino, who has done so much important work looking at Hispanic ministry, the experience of Catholicism through a Latino perspective. And so just a couple of pieces from an article he wrote in May of 2014 for our Sunday Visitor. Hispanics account for 71% of the growth of the Catholic population in the United States since 1960. Of the more than 50 million Hispanics living in the US, 59% self-identify as Catholic. Approximately 55% of all US Catholics under the age of 30 are Hispanic. So many shifts, changes. It's hard to kind of keep up with it. But as welcome and interesting as all of that is, change can still be challenging. You know, how do we respond? What's called for? What does it mean for groups that may feel like they're in more decline than in growth? All of this can be challenging. Events, tragedies, crises also affect communities of faith. So of course we are sadly familiar with the awful costs of the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church and how that has affected communities of faith locally and much more broadly than that. Other awful events, tragedies, I'm sure we are still heartbroken for the experience in Charleston, South Carolina, last June, where 9 people who were engaged in Bible study at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church were shot and killed. Awful crises affecting communities of faith. Parish closings, mergers, restructuring, we're familiar with that, very familiar with that in Boston. Again, from the Pew Research Center from November 2014, in 1988, there were 19,705 parishes in the US, while there are now 17,483. That's CARA research reported by the Pew Center. That, even though the number of Catholics, self-identified Catholics, has grown in the US, but it's attributable to other factors, such as the drop in the percentage of Catholics who still go to Mass every week, okay? Or the drop in active priests, or financial reasons. So for important reasons, some of this restructuring is happening, and it can be quite welcome in many ways. At the same time, these are changes, shifts, that can be challenging. And then finally, we're aware that in some religious communities, there is decline in numbers or change. You know, we see some very creative work going on with some religious communities in terms of affiliating, merging with other groups to share resources, etc. So we know we're living this, right? Loss, change in communities of faith. It's a daily reality. So what I'd like to invite you to do now in this first window is, if you choose, to do a couple of minutes of reflecting, personally first. What significant losses or changes have you faced in the past or might you be facing now? Did any of those categories of Mitchell and Anderson kind of resonate with you? All right? And then reflecting on your communities of faith, and I put that in the plural because sometimes people feel connected to multiple communities of faith. Have your communities faced significant losses or changes in the past or now? And if so, how have you and your communities been responding to that? How have you been coping with that? You might want to pick one of those questions to focus on, and I'm going to invite you to write for maybe a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll invite you to turn to 1 or 2 other people at your table if you choose. And if you really feel like, no, this is too personal, I don't want to share, just let your colleagues know that. And then I will bring us back together and we'll hear a couple of thoughts. Okay, thank you. But what I'd like to do now is move on to our second section, responding to loss and change with resilience. And so a few assumptions that I'm making here, that when we're faced with loss and change, we have to respond in some way, given that we're alive. We have to do something when we're faced with loss and change. And so often what happens is our coping skills get called on, and sometimes they get tested. Sometimes we find that our coping skills aren't up to the task. Some attempts to cope might be helpful in just letting us get by, allowing us to survive, but not much more than that. But our question for today is, how might we cope in ways that allow us and our communities not just to survive, but to thrive, to flourish? And that brings us to this territory of resilience. And here are 2 definitions that I have found that I like. The first is from an article some of you may have read in Time magazine just last June. The cover story was on resilience. And so I'm going to be drawing on some of the research that was presented there. But this is a definition offered by that author. Resilience is essentially a set of skills, as opposed to a disposition or personality type, that makes it possible for people not only to get through hard times, but to thrive during and after them. Just as rubber rebounds after being squeezed or squished, so do resilient people. Okay? What's key there is it's a set of skills versus a personality type, which is right out of the gate a very hopeful statement. It is not the case that, well, if you're lucky, you're born resilient. And if you weren't born resilient, oh boy, good luck with life. It's just this, the research is unequivocal. Resilience can be learned. So very hopeful statement. And this second definition from a PBS special called This Emotional Life. We have many ways of overcoming adversity. Resilience is the capacity to adapt successfully in the face of threats or disaster. People can improve their capacity for resilience at any time of life. Yay, yay, so hopeful. Now, I think it's interesting and important to kind of tease out a little bit, what is the relationship between resilience and self-care? Because aren't we very, very familiar with talking about self-care in ministry? And, you know, some people take to self-care like a duck to water, and other people feel kind of resistant to it, like, no, you know, I'm about something else in the world. What does that have to do with resilience? And part of why this question has occurred to me is because I had a conversation with a group of people last year, and we were talking about self-care, and some of them said something really helpful to me, which is that in their experience, some of the folks in ministry that they know are so dedicated to self-care that they never actually get to do the ministry itself. That was so helpful to me, because in my experience, it's kind of the opposite. I've met more people who are kind of resistant to self-care. It feels selfish or self-absorbed, but that's not their experience. And of course, that makes sense, right? Everything tends to exist on a continuum, so there would be those who would be really devoted to self-care. So that's why I am posing this question for us. And I found a very helpful way of thinking about the relationship on the website of the American Psychological Association. They have a whole piece there called The Road to Resilience. It's quite good. But this is what they say. Taking care of yourself, there's the self-care, helps to keep your mind and body primed to deal with situations that require resilience. I find that helpful. So self-care is a means of building or cultivating resilience. It's not an end unto itself, okay? But we need some self-care in order to become more resilient people. We're creating a mind and a body and spirit that can bounce back when adversity strikes. Now, I think it's really important that we also think about the connection between resilience and ministry. Everyone in this room is familiar to some degree with ministry. So what is the nature of ministry, and what is it that calls for resilience in ministry? Now, before you look at the next slide where I've made some suggestions, let's just pause for a moment, because you already know. What is it about the nature of ministry that calls for resilience? What is it that can tax our coping abilities to the point where we really need to be pretty resilient? Everybody have some thoughts? All right, let's see if yours are on this list and what you would add. So this list is culled from a variety of sources. You can see they're all on the reference list. How does ministry require resilience? The emotional nature of the demands. So often you are with people in difficult moments, suffering, vulnerability. It's quite emotional. The relentlessness of the workload. Does it ever stop? No. Dealing with conflicts. Wouldn't the work be so much easier if there weren't also conflicts? Right? There's some quite good research looking at conflict in ministry and how much time ministers are spending trying to manage conflict. Not do the work, manage conflict among the staff or other people. Secondary stress, vicarious traumatization, this insight that when people such as ministers are repeatedly hearing the stories of other people's traumatic experiences, it takes its toll on the listener over time. This is quite well understood now. People are describing it as vicarious traumatization. It has effects on how the caregiver starts to think about life, the world, God. Challenging boundaries, we know that, right? You can be in multiple relationships despite your best efforts with the same person. It can be very complicated. Excessive administration in meetings. Again, wouldn't the work be great if you just could get rid of the meetings? I used to work with a wonderful, wonderful colleague years and years and years ago, and she kept us on task, and she got things done. But she also cultivated a nickname. People got to the point of when they saw her coming, they'd say, here comes a meeting waiting to happen. Because and she understood and laughed, but it was, she got things done, but those meetings were just exhausting. First line responders, right? There's again, quite a lot of research that suggests that when people are in crisis, who do they want to call first? It's often their pastoral caregiver, their religious leader. Frequent moves and relocations, new assignments, etc. Low financial remuneration, which creates its own stress. The work can be very isolating. I often think of hospital chaplains, who some have described feeling like they are chaplain also to the staff, to the physicians, the nurses, the social workers, but that can create quite a lot of isolation. Who are your colleagues that you get to just unload with? The expectations people have of those in ministry, which are not always realistic. There can be a lack of support. And others. Did you think of others as well? Okay, when we get to the conversation part in a little bit, I'd love to hear those. But clearly, ministry is demanding, challenging, calls for resilience. I want to share a little bit of research looking at stress and burnout in ministry. And as I said at the beginning, these are not necessarily Catholic settings, but they can still be suggestive for us. So a 1991 survey by the Fuller Institute of Church Growth suggests that 50% of respondents had considered leaving their ministry vocation in the previous 3 months because of the stress. And a 2008 survey of 800 plus parish-based clergy, 18% felt burnt out, 23% depressed, 45% felt high or moderate in emotional exhaustion. That's quite concerning. And of course, we know that some people make the decision that they have to leave ministry because they feel burned out. This research, you could see at the top by Jackson Jordan, the author identified three predictors, in a sense, of clergy burnout in some of the studies. So one was compassion fatigue, responding constantly to people in crisis, trying to be compassionate. It can just wear people out. So a survey of 285 evangelical pastors indicated that compassion fatigue was a very significant factor, putting them at risk for burnout. Conflict management style. So a study of several hundred interfaith clergy suggested that how one manages conflict, one's style, has quite a lot to do with burnout. So those who drew on what we would call a more avoidant style, you just try not to deal with the conflict, or accommodating, you might sort of surrender your position just to kind of, again, make it go away. They were at higher levels of burnout than those who used more competing or collaborative styles. And then another category, expectations of the role, and then low control over whether you succeed at the work was another factor. So this phrase, vision conflict by Wickman, that sometimes people go into ministry assuming that it's going to look a certain way, and it ends up looking a very different way, which of course can happen in any profession, right? But also coupled with sometimes people feeling like they don't have a lot of control over how their work turns out, can be a predictor of burnout. So here's our second opportunity to think about this a little bit. I'd like to ask you to reflect on what challenges your resilience in ministry. And if you're not actively in ministry now, you could just think generally about life. What challenges your resilience? Is it some of those things on the list or other? And how about your communities of faith? Communities, of course, get challenged. So what do you see happening in your communities of faith? Do you feel like the resilience of the community is being challenged? And if so, how? And how do you know? How do you know when you're getting burned out or compassion fatigue or you're just feeling sort of on the road to not being resilient? How do you know? What are the signs, the indicators for you? So I'd like to invite, again, 2 minutes of individual writing, and then a few minutes of talking to one another, and then we'll come back and open it up for some large group comments. Thank you. Okay, everyone, so we are picking up with our third section now, which is practices to foster and sustain resilience. And as I said when I first introduced resilience, I find this just very, very hopeful, that the brain can be trained to become more resilient. It's never too late. So this quote from the Time magazine article: "Forget the old adage that you won't know what you're made of until you're tested. The latest science shows that if you train your brain, how you act under pressure can, in large part, be up to you." There's been, it seems to me, a growing body of research in resilience, brain studies, etc. It's quite interesting. And one of the conclusions seems to be that there is not one road to resilience, and that's another piece of good news, that whatever works for you is a good choice. But through various research studies, and they're on the reference list, these factors seem to emerge repeatedly as helpful. A strong spiritual life and relationship with God. Surprise! Surprise, everybody. Relationship with God matters. But it's just always interesting when that shows up in studies. Mindfulness, very significant. You know, being able to be in the moment, present in the moment, to be aware of what's happening, to have interior space to respond in a thoughtful way rather than a reactive way. That's some of what we mean by mindfulness. Inner peace. Community support, good friends, emerges as critically important to resilience. The belief that one can overcome adversity. And satisfaction in the job. If we're talking about resilience at the workplace, enjoying your work, despite the challenges of it, contributes to resilience. Those are some of the factors. But then I also like, this again is from the Time magazine article, 10 resilience builders. This is based on the research of a couple of people who have a new book coming out. And it's just kind of fun to see a top 10 list. So let's look at these. And then in our fourth section, we're going to contemplate what we might do with a list such as this through theological reflection. But their list is develop a core set of beliefs that nothing can shake. Try to find meaning in whatever stressful or traumatic thing has happened, such as, you know, a major loss, the Red Sox or the soccer team. What's the meaning? Try to maintain a positive outlook. Take cues from someone who is especially resilient. It's important, you know, as we look to mentors and guides on our journeys, you know, who do we know who seems resilient, who we can learn from? Not someone who's never suffered, that would not be helpful, but someone who has found out how to respond to suffering in a way that seems to contribute to thriving. Don't run from things that scare you, face them. And that's going back to some of that work on neural pathways that perhaps because of our evolutionary heritage, you know, there was a day at some point when humans needed to run from things that scared them, like the lion, or you wouldn't survive. But that neural pathway has become so deeply embedded in many of our brains that we run from whatever scares us, thus reinforcing that response. But there is, you know, some of the research suggests that if we actually confront our fears, that's the beginning of creating a new neural pathway that we can then draw on more consistently. Be quick to reach out for support when things go haywire. Learn new things as often as you can. That's, again, that brain research, right? That we can actually create new neurons and new neural pathways. And exercise can do the same thing. Find an exercise regimen you'll stick to. Don't beat yourself up or dwell on the past. How interesting that one is. And recognize what makes you uniquely strong and own it. Now, these are suggestions for individuals, but our interest is also communities of faith. So I want to suggest, before we leave this slide, I want to suggest that I think some of this is important for a community of faith. You know, how do we encourage our communities to face those things that scare us? You know, maybe some of the changes, the shifts in religious life. Maybe that's scary to some. How do we help people to face that? Finding meaning. Meaning is important individually, but also communally. Okay? And a core set of beliefs, of course, we would assume is central to all faith communities. So I want to suggest that maybe much of this is important as we think about our communities. But then I also want to share just a little bit of work that I have seen done on resilience in communities of faith. And in preparation for today, I have been looking for, what is out there? What do we know about how communities of faith cultivate resilience? What are the hallmarks of communities of faith that are thriving? And you all already know this, I'm sure. A lot of what is out there is interesting, but it's maybe a somewhat different question. It's things like, what are the hallmarks of parishes that are growing versus parishes that are in decline? And by the way, drums seems significant. That I saw that in one study. Parishes that have drums as part of their worship seem to be growing. Those without drums are more often in decline. So there'll be a run on drums tomorrow. But that's a somewhat different question than I think I'm offering us today. How do we think about resilience more broadly in communities of faith when a crisis hits, when a tragedy strikes, when a community is facing unwelcome change? How do we think about resilience? And I will continue the hunt, but I have not seen a lot yet on that particular question. But I did come across this, which is so striking to me. This is a fairly new book called Building the Resilient Community by Jan Holton, who is at Yale Divinity School. And it's based on years of ethnographic research she has done with survivors of the war in Sudan, including some of the members of the group that came to be known as the Lost Boys of the Sudan. And she was able to be in continual conversation with some of these survivors and was astonished by the resilience of some in terms of, surviving horrific traumas, tragedies, witnessing awful violence, etc., and yet finding ways to construct a meaningful life. And how do we understand that? How do some people do that and some seem not able to do that? And what she found through her research with some of these survivors, both in the US and in Sudan, was two things. She teases them out nicely, but in essence, the first is a deeply felt sense of communal obligation, that one's life is not just about oneself, that some of these survivors felt clear, and it had been kind of embedded in them before they left Sudan, you have obligations to this whole community. And that deeply, deeply felt sense of communal obligation and care seemed to characterize these very resilient survivors. And then the second key hallmark was the importance, the centrality of their narrative of faith. how they understood God's redemptive healing activity in the world and their responsibility to be part of that in some way. Very interesting, very important, and something I think for us to ponder, as we work with communities of faith. What would be those hallmarks that we would want to draw on to foster, to strengthen resilience? So, I'd like us to do another sort of moment of reflection here, to reflect on your experience of resilience, either in your own life or in your communities of faith. What is it that seems to build or sustain resilience? Are you part of a resilient community of faith? And if so, how do you understand that? What do you think some of those features are? Is there something akin to what Holton's describing, that sense of communal obligation, deep community ties, the faith narrative? What is it, do you think, that contributes to resilience in a community as well as in an individual? So I'd like to invite you, if you choose, to another couple of minutes of individual writing and then some conversation with others. If you want to talk to someone you haven't spoken with yet, feel free to do that. You can move around the room, whatever you'd like. So 2 minutes, please, first by yourselves, and then I'll invite you to turn to a couple of other people. Thank you. This work on resilience that is cutting across a variety of fields, I think is very interesting and significant. But for our purposes, too, we want to think theologically about resilience. How would we want to consider, interpret, reflect on this sort of area theologically? And what I'd like to do is take a brief walk through 3 different perspectives that I will pull together at the end that I think each offer us something, some way of entering into theological reflection on resilience. So the first is attachment theory, and these pictures are John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, and they are considered the primary movers of attachment theory. And it's a school of thought within developmental psychology, really, that looks at behaviors that we begin to see in infants that are called attachment behaviors. And that impulse that infants have from the earliest moments of life to seek what they need through crying, through squirming, whatever it might be. And those needs, even though we hope, we don't always cry and squirm through life, but the needs that those behaviors reflect persist, Bowlby said, from the cradle to the grave. None of us ever outgrows our need to feel a deep attachment to significant others. And some of the key phrases of attachment theory: what is the goal of these behaviors that you see in little kids, and then you see maybe some different behaviors in adults? We want to know that our attachment figure, which in childhood is usually the parent or the primary caregiver, in adulthood it might be your closest friend, your partner. We want to know that that person is available. And what does availability mean? That they're accessible and responsive. If the baby cries and no one's there to hear it, then that communicates something to the infant. Nobody was accessible. If somebody hears the cry and doesn't respond for whatever reason, and there can be varieties of reasons, that also communicates something over time. So that idea of being both accessible and responsive is what's important. And what does that responsiveness mean? Bowlby described it as willingness to act as comforter and protector. That's what kids need. That's on some level what adults continue to need. And Ainsworth, his colleague, used this terrific language of secure base, which has become very important to many attachment researchers. Ainsworth said that the attachment figure should function as a secure base for the child from which he or she can then explore the environment, because he or she knows they can come back to that secure base. I always picture it as sort of like a big boulder. You know, you can keep touching back to that big boulder, and then you go out and explore your world again. And, you know, some of the research shows that the more kids feel that they have that secure base of comfort, protection, you know, responsiveness, the more exploratory behavior they do demonstrate. But the reverse is also true. The less confident kids feel that they have that secure base, often the less exploratory behavior you see. You see sometimes more clingy behavior. They're afraid to leave the attachment figure, the parent, because they're not sure what's going to happen while they're gone. Okay? Now, this is just a little bit of a snapshot of a pretty vast field, but Ainsworth also helped us to think about styles of attachment. That, you know, our way of attaching, we can think of it as existing on a continuum. You know, these aren't hard and fast categories. But some kids and adults tend to have a more secure style of attachment. They expect their caregivers to be accessible and responsive. That's what life has taught them, that they can expect that. Some kids have not learned that. They have what we would call a more anxious or ambivalent style, maybe for various reasons. And this isn't about blaming parents, by the way, either. I want to be clear about that. There can be a variety of reasons why parents aren't available and responsive. But consequently, sometimes kids aren't sure what they're going to get when they cry or ask for help. And so they develop some anxiety about that. And that can carry into adulthood. And then there can be this avoidant category too, where sadly, for whatever reasons, kids have learned that typically what they're going to get if they seek that care and protection is they're going to get rejected. And so they learn to sort of defend themselves, protect themselves from that by looking like they don't want that connection anymore. Bowlby described it as compulsive self-reliance. You know, we all want to be self-reliant, but when it's sort of a compulsive, self-protective thing, that's when you might wonder if there's a little bit of an avoidant style of attachment going on. Now, what does this have to do with thinking theologically about resilience? Well, interestingly, even though there's been lots and lots of work done on attachment theory, there's been much less done on attachment to God. How do we think theologically about styles of attachment? The Gordon Kaufman, former theologian at Harvard Divinity School, did a little bit of writing describing God as perhaps an absolutely adequate attachment figure, able to be that responsive, accessible caregiver. And Philip Bennett, a pastoral psychotherapist, has proposed that when God functions as our ultimate secure base, people may better negotiate separation and loss. All humans will fail us at some point, right? So no one provides the perfect secure base to anybody else, which is why many of us on our spiritual journey might want to think about cultivating a sense of God as our ultimate secure base that helps, that relationship helps us when we're facing loss. Well, what do we do with that proposition? It's interesting that a little bit of research is starting to kind of look at this, which I think is sometimes helpful. The first study was done by Belovich and Pargament, and they interviewed 155 people who were waiting in a hospital waiting room for a loved one going through surgery. And part of the interview was getting a sense of how people describe their relationship with God. Those who described that more secure style of attachment to God coped in what they call a more spiritually positive way. And that, that's a longer conversation for another day. But that positive coping seemed related to better adjustment. Okay? In other words, those who felt God available to them as that ultimate secure base seemed to do better with their stress in the hospital waiting room. And then the second study is one that I did with a colleague in 2012. I interviewed or surveyed 93 people who had experienced a significant death in the prior year, and more secure attachment to God emerged as the most significant factor in the study, and it seemed to buffer people from depression and grief. It seemed to lead to greater meaning, greater stress-related growth, and more positive religious coping. So what I want to suggest here, and we'll tie this all together at the end, but as we think theologically about resilience, one important place to go is how do we think about our relationship with God? How do we help our communities of faith to think about their relationship with God? And can we help all of us to cultivate a deeper sense of God as our ultimate secure base? So that's perspective one. The second perspective is narrative and loss. You all know there's been so much creative stuff done in terms of story, narrative. We are all people of stories. If some of you have met for the first time today, perhaps you've already begun to share a little bit of your story with one another. Where you're from, how you got into this work, why you're here today, how your community of faith is experiencing change and loss, etc. Those are all parts of our stories. We all tend, to some degree, to think of our lives in terms of stories. If I tell you the story of my life, there's a plot, there are characters, major and minor characters, there's a theme. If I asked you, what is one of the most important themes of your life story? Be interesting to see what you would say. But my guess is we would all be able to do that. We would all be able to say, this blank, whatever it is an important theme of my life story. Service, justice, commitment to God, love of family, whatever it might be. This is just kind of how we're hardwired. We see this cross-culturally as well. We are people of stories. So what happens when we experience loss or change, if we think of our story, as a book, loss or change can be like someone has pulled pages out of our book. Niemeyer calls it an experience of narrative disruptions. I have certainly heard people who've had an unexpected death or an unexpected loss say things like, I feel like the life I was living just got ripped up. It doesn't make any sense anymore. I don't even know how to think about the future. It's sort of like the future story doesn't work anymore because those pages got ripped out. Why is that so challenging? This is Robert Niemeyer. He says, like a novel that loses a central character in the middle chapters, the life story disrupted by loss must be reorganized, rewritten, to find a new strand of continuity that bridges the past with the future in an intelligible fashion. In other words, we have to figure out what the story is going to be once loss has happened, and that is not easy. And why is that not easy? It's because our stories reflect the meaning of our lives, don't they? Why are you all in this room today? Well, there's a story there. What is it that brought you to being here today at this moment? There's a story there. And I would imagine that it has something to do with what's meaningful in your life, what you find meaningful. Okay? So stories, meaning are inextricably connected. And they reflect our hope for the future. We started the morning with a prayer service moving from lament to hope. Well, we all want to live in hope, and that's the call of our faith as well, to live in hope. But when the story that kind of held our hope has been mucked with, it can be very challenging to find the hope. Okay? So during or after struggle, loss, crisis for individuals and communities, it's often meanings that have to get understood and healed for that hope to emerge again. And of course, this happens with relationship with God as well. Don't we know how many of you in your work or in your own life have heard people say, how could God have let this happen? How could a loving God allow this to happen? So loss can shake our faith story as well, how we understand God, how we make faith meaning in narrative disruption. And what do we do about that with individuals or communities? Well, meaning is co-constructed. This is the work of Niemeyer again. None of us makes meaning in a vacuum. All of us need others to help us figure out the new meaning or to reclaim meaning that has felt shaken. So, think of all the work that people in ministry do. We're hearing people's stories. We're noticing maybe where it's been disrupted. We're listening for the meaning. What has happened to the meaning? How is someone making meaning of this? And then we're supporting people as they figure out how to go on, what the new story's going to be, what the new meaning's going to be. So this is a very important area in grief work for sure. But I'm going to make some suggestions of how it's important with resilience as well. And finally, the third perspective is this area of spiritual religious coping. We know that in a time of loss or change, many people turn to their religion, to their faith. Not everybody does, but many people do, to help them cope. But what we also know is that not all religious coping is created equal. There's been some really important research now. Pargament and Abu Raya did a study looking at 10 years of research in religious coping. And some of the ways people drew on their religion, their religious resources to cope, were related to good outcomes, such as they felt closer to their church and to God. They experienced optimism in the face of racism, which I find really interesting. Less depression, better tolerance of chronic pain. These are some of the outcomes that show up in some of the studies. Well, what are the religious coping efforts that yield those helpful outcomes? They can be boiled down to these three things in this study, okay? First, when people experienced or described a secure relationship with God, God is the secure base, they tended to do better. When they believed that there was a greater meaning, that's the piece we just did. When people felt that there was some greater meaning, even if they didn't understand it, that they could sort of rely on, they tended to do better. And when they had a connection to some sort of faith or spiritual community, they tended to do better. Okay? Secure relationship with God, belief in greater meaning, and connection to a faith community. So I want to suggest just one way that this all perhaps comes together in a diagrammatic fashion. This is a diagram from that research study that I did. And I just want to point out this block in the middle says secure attachment to God. In my study, and these again were people who had had a significant death in the prior year, those who described their relationship with God as more secure had greater meaning, less depression up in the corner, less grief, more positive religious coping, as we were just talking about, and more stress-related growth. And then the converse was true. The less securely attached people felt to God, the more depression, the more grief, the less meaning. Okay? So this is hardly exhaustive. It's only one study, and it had its limits. But I think it's a way to visualize literally how central secure attachment to God became the centerpiece of this whole study in terms of outcomes. So what I'd like to do now is go back to that top 10 list from the Time magazine article. And I want to suggest, and this is only suggestive because we would each turn to different faith resources to think about this. But if we want to think theologically about resilience, and first we're drawing on that idea of God as the ultimate secure base. Remember the number one tip, develop a core set of beliefs that nothing can shake. Well, theologically, from our faith life, that's everything, right? And how important it could be to turn to something like 1 John. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. And this idea of don't run from things that scare you, face them. It's interesting to think about that in terms of neural pathways and all that. But how much likelier it is that we could do that if we believe deeply the words of Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So there are so many ways that our faith and these invitations to think of God, to turn to God as the ultimate secure base, are right there to help us think about resilience theologically. And then this idea of narrative meaning making. One of the top 10 was try to find meaning in whatever stressful or traumatic thing has happened. Well, what meaning? How do we choose a meaning? Well, from a faith perspective, we might turn to something like 1 Corinthians 13. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. We will not understand suffering in this lifetime. We will never fully understand suffering, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. There is meaning in suffering. There is meaning in endurance. From a faith perspective, we can think about meaning in different ways. And there's meaning in mystery. We won't understand it all in this lifetime, but then we will see face to face. And then this idea of try to maintain a positive outlook. From a faith perspective, we might want to think about substituting hopeful for that word positive. Hopeful. Hope grounded in faith. That lament is not the end of the story. That we are resurrection people. John 10:10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. That's not a promise of no suffering. An abundant life typically will include suffering. But we understand it in a different way. We understand God's love as abundantly available through it all. And then finally, thinking about resilience through this lens of spiritual and religious coping, how we turn to the faith resources, faith practices to cultivate resilience. So that, from the list again, be quick to reach out for support when things go haywire. Well, what better place to reach out than the community of faith? We're part of something bigger than ourselves, and we hold each other through our prayer and witness. I often think, when we show up for Mass or service, we're typically not thinking, okay, well, part of what I'm doing here is helping others cultivate resilience. But that is part of what we're doing. That is part of what we're doing. We are participating in the community that holds one another in those trying times. And then don't beat yourself up or dwell on the past. Well, one of the gifts of the church is reconciliation. That we have a faithful, prayerful way of reflecting on our mistakes, our sinfulness, and moving through it. So these are suggestions, purely suggestions. You would do something different with this, I'm sure, but a way to think theologically about resilience, how we would turn to the riches of the tradition, of the faith, of the community, to help us, and perhaps thinking about that in terms of drawing on God as the ultimate secure base, finding theological faith meaning even when the narrative has been disrupted, and drawing on our religious resources in ways that lead to helpful coping rather than less helpful. So we are down to our last few minutes. So what I'd like to suggest is maybe just a couple of minutes of individual writing first, and then why don't we open it up for a few large group comments to conclude. So you're welcome to reflect on any of these questions, or maybe there's something else you just want to jot down as we bring our work together to a close. Just for a minute, please. I think we need to stop, but I want to thank you all very much for coming today and participating, and I wish you all the best in your work.